Hello. Ni hao? Is that good? Okay. Thank you. So I'm here to speak to you about building DevRelopers and talk about the proactive and the reactive ways to do this. As you mentioned, my name's Jessica West. I go by Jess. Oh, it's not progressing. Where's my clicker? Sorry. And I work at Algolia, which is a hosted search API that allows you to have an instant search-like experience. So what exactly is a DevReloper? Some of you may be asking this term. It's basically a term tossed around as an individual contributor that works on the developer relations team, that is a person from your company to interact with the community of developers. We can see these titles. They're commonly used across the industry: developer evangelist, developer advocate, community engineer, engineer advocate, developer marketer, technical community manager, person that does all the things. And though we see these titles in different places, the idea is generally the same. You need someone that can interact with your community of developers and internal departments. So if we take a look at history and trends from Google and when this term started becoming more of a thing. First, developer evangelism isn't really a new thing. It's actually been around since 1982. See Apple and Microsoft as those teams. However, in 2010, Twilio hired their first developer evangelist, and they were a company doing something slightly different from a product company, serving a way to interact with the developers in a different way. This was able to pioneer how we start engaging the developers here moving forward. So with that, every team needs a strategy. And building your team and strategy upfront is essential to your success. It's a matter of your strategy and your players that will determine how you move your business forward. Has anybody heard of the game Risk board game? Raise of hands. 3? Okay, I will explain the concept real quick. So the Risk is a game of a strategic conquest. And what I mean by that is players start out with a set of army figures, and they place them strategically around the map in order to occupy these territories. Players then try to conquer each other's territories by invading and engaging in battles. Depending on the roll of the dice, the player will either win or lose that battle. And then the player eliminates all their opponents of that territory, ultimately wins the game. Now you might be asking, what does that game have to do with developer relations? So there's 2 strategies in playing Risk. One is an aggressively building up armies and acquiring territories. And the other is concentrating on holding the against the enemy attack, which typically ends up in a weaker position. So we can look at these strategies as a proactive and a reactive strategy. The proactive is building up those armies and going against your enemy. And reactive is waiting for the battle to come to you and holding your ground. Being strategic in building your team, knowing the what and the why and the how will ultimately determine how your team succeeds. And I'm here to tell you that if you aren't proactive with your team, with your strategies, your team will ultimately fail. By definition, reactive is acting in response to a situation rather than creating or controlling it. So this is a nice word cloud of what DevRel can seem like it. We've got lots of great things. We touch different departments and different aspects, so it can be quite a big task. And this looks really cool and fun, right? There's community, APIs, content, create, and you get excited looking at this. Like, I want to be in developer relations after looking at this. However, in reality, it looks a lot more like this big, daunting list. Don't worry, it's not supposed to be readable. But this is a lot to ask for one team, especially starting out, and it's really unlikely you'll get down to inbox 0. So everyone's super excited about this new department. Your touch points include sales, marketing, engineering, product, HR, culture, business development, you name it. Everyone wants access to your expertise from your team. So of course, it's easy to be pulled into multiple directions in different areas, and that can take up 110% of your time, not including anything driving your department forward. In developer relations, one's ability to present a concept and present a product often depends on contact with the community. For example, attending events, writing blog posts, presenting code. So where do we start? Let's try doing some JavaScript and install developer relations. And this sounds great in theory, but how do we do this in practice? There's a specific skill set that's needed for finding a really good team player. And finding people to join your team like this early on will be key in helping you create synergy and success. The first one, technical aptitude. You have to have a technical aptitude and a desire to maintain coding throughout your team. Someone needs to be able to write a quick demo and get it out in a reasonable manner, and then produce a polished demo. Writing skills. You need to be able to write fluidly and technically. Writing content that's easily digestible is really important to reach your users and your community. The next thing, people skills. You want to be able to be approachable and let people be able to engage with you at different events, maybe come up and speak, and make sure that you are representing your company to those developers. So now you're asking, which department should I be under? Should it be product, marketing, engineering? If you're in product, you may need to focus more on content and upcoming releases and making sure that you are aligned with whatever your product team is doing and that your developer relations team is ready to execute on that. If you're in marketing, you may need to focus on events or helping development with leads. And then if you're in engineering, you need to maintain documentation or your SDKs or engage the online community exclusively because they need that kind of voice. So are we looking at evangelism, advocacy, community? Phil Legetter of Nexmo writes a really good post to help you get started on what you can be looking at within your company and developer relations. This is a great resource to help you get started and think about your strategies and start seeing how you might want to measure this. At the end of his blog post, he wrote this nice little meter. And what we can do is choose different actions in that one and see if you're leaning more towards an evangelism or advocacy. So here, for example, we chose webinars, talks, sponsor events. And here he's saying it's leaning more towards evangelism, so it's a little more community heavy. The other one, if we choose, let's say, write documentation, create quick start apps, capture developer feedback, developer libraries, answer support queries, leans more towards advocacy. And so then we're doing more on the content execution side. So what if your company wants it all? Yikes, it's a lot. Too much. And so it's too much up front, and it's important to recognize that you cannot do this all out of the gates. You need to take a step back and look at what your strategy and direction is. You'll likely be pulled into all these different directions, which is really not good for anybody. So where do you start? So proactive, it's essential to your success. By definition, creating or controlling a situation by causing something to happen rather than responding to it after it's happened. First, we need to define what your organization needs. This will look likely different at different companies. Not all SaaS companies are the same, has the same needs as they have different paths of growth. Do they have a paid API? Is there a free version? Do you even have an API yet? Are you an API company? These all bring you to your next decision tree in deciding what your best objective and definition is. So what is your bottom line objective? These are important questions to ask yourself when you're creating this team. Are you here to increase qualified leads and bring them to your marketing department? Is it pure brand exposure? Stealing market share from your competition? Or you just want more developers using your API? Defining 1 to 2 key performance indicators to measure success against your team is a great place to start. This will be your key to success. You need to focus on those 1 to 2 things and do it really, really well. So this, for example, could be increasing your developer traffic on your site by 20%. Or maybe you're increasing your developer accounts by 10%. Or attending events this year that your competition has historically been at. In addition to defining your objectives, and this is really important, you need to find an executive sponsor in your corner. This executive must truly understand your goals and how you'll get there. They will be your ally in meetings to help justify the expenses of your department and why. This will ultimately make or break your team. So it's really important to have that executive sponsor and make sure they're on the same page for what you're doing as a department. So they say good things come in threes. So let's take a look at some concepts to help you get started. So evangelism is a triangle. You can think of it as like a trifecta of things you need to do. You need to hit all 3 types of connections with people in multiple ways and multiple times. You want to do this in person, in content, and in code. And for this, iteration is key. If someone in the community might click on your brand from just one event, or maybe they don't quite recognize what you're doing until they read a blog post. Or you write a demo from an event that you went to and publish it afterwards, and then that piece of code, that's what makes it click. But you need to hit all 3 of those areas within your evangelism team and what you're doing with your strategies in order to really make that impact in that customer. In 2014, Brandon West of Kickbox defined 3 C's as core principles for your efforts in reaching developers: code, content, community. I highly recommend reading this as well when you're discussing with your executive about what you're doing for your developer relations department. This can help you start dissecting, what am I doing and how are my strategies for this? So the first one, let's go through code. If you're trying to reach developers, you need to code. And this can be done in a number of ways. We can do tech support. You can be helping with your engineering team. You could be maintaining your SDKs or any kind of documentation. You could be writing getting started demos to help engage those junior developers on your community and making sure that whatever you're doing at the very beginning is very clear. And you could be doing advanced API examples. So taking what, after they've gotten started with your product, what's really cool? Highlight those kind of things. Or finally, doing a mashup with another company. Show how your API works really well with another one and get people really interested and engaged with your product. You can't just code, though, because it's not enough to solve a developer's problem in an abstract way. You need to proactively publish very clear and concrete examples of implementations and find it in a relatively easy way to consume. This can be done through documentation, blog posts, or really thorough demo post explained. So pulling out pieces of content and writing around why you made those decisions. And finally, community. You need a way to reach your developers to show them that code and content that you just created. So this requires personal connection. And to build those personal connections, you need to contribute and give back to those communities. Always trying to give first and be there, present, before you ask them once to say, hey, engage with my API. And this can be done by attending events, sponsoring events, supporting open source projects, or engaging with your online communities wherever they live and breathe. So it's the repetition, those multiple touch points, that really get developers to understand your product. So again, taking those code, content, community, in-person, events, you need to take those, do them on repeat for those people to actually get what you're working on. We're all individuals. We all learn and understand in different ways. So we react and engage with brands in different ways, which is why it's really important for you to have each point of contact with your community defined and executed on. So the coding, blogging, conversation. Now that you have the tools for what you need to do, let's talk about the how you need to execute. You just need to remember to drive. Also, I like cars, so you get the slide. So drive, or define your objectives and deliverables easy on. Figure out how best to measure them. Review this with your executive sponsor and team, and communicate to the company the what and the why. This will help you carve out space for what your team is doing differently and why it's needed in your company. You want to iterate on your approaches and do retrospectives to see what worked and what didn't. It's really important to stay agile and to keep your feedback loop open. You want to be able to validate your findings. We are a data-driven society. We make decisions based on what we find out. And so you want to show your success in metrics that you've set up for your team. And then finally, evolve. After seeing success or failure in these items, you want to be able to improve your strategy and your team. So you want to do this on repeat. After you've figured out that worked, that didn't, iterate, adapt, evolve. Anil Dash of Fog Creek Software defined DevRel Bill of Rights earlier this year. Or last year, because it's 2018. And these serve as a best practice on how your DevRel team should and can function. The first two, in my opinion, are the ones that need to be addressed before anything else, and I think they're quite important. First one is a clear set of business goals. This is dictating a strategy and clearly defined for you to communicate to your team and company. The next one is a well-defined place in the organization. So it goes back to what department are you in? And what is your contribution to that team and to that department? It's important to recognize what your objectives are and how they align with those company goals and how that aligns with your department. And of course, that will look different in every company. So to summarize, define your objectives early on and have a clear idea of what you're working on and why. Find your executive sponsor and make them your biggest ally. Define how your team will be measured and what performance will highlight your team's work. Communicate outside your team. DevRel as a product is still a new concept, so it's really important to help educate your company on what you're doing and what your department is, and that will help you create allies in other departments. Iteration and adaptation. The market changes, and so do your company offerings. So your objectives can change quarter to quarter, and that's completely okay. However, you have to make sure your team is flexible and able to move and change with those objectives until you get that rhythm going. My name is Jessica. Please feel free to come find me if you have any questions afterwards. Thank you. Seshe.